$1 billion. Justice Neil Gorsuch's voice thundered through the Supreme Court chamber, each syllable landing like a hammer blow. The spectators gasped audibly as the conservative justice glared down at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from his elevated bench. This court finds that not only did Crockett Industries knowingly contaminate the groundwater of 3 communities, but Representative Crockett herself, as CEO, personally approved the decision to conceal environmental testing data from federal regulators. The camera zoomed in on Crockett's face as the color drained from it. The normally composed Congresswoman, who had built her political career advocating for environmental justice in underserved communities, appeared utterly shattered. Her attorney frantically whispered in her ear, but she seemed not to hear him. Justice Gorsuch continued, his voice cutting like steel. The court is particularly troubled by evidence showing the defendant used her subsequent position in Congress to attempt to weaken the very environmental regulations her company had violated. He lifted a document for all to see. This penalty represents the largest environmental fine in Supreme Court history, and this court believes it is fully justified given the defendant's extraordinary hypocrisy and betrayal of public trust. The chamber erupted in chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits, already broadcasting news of the landmark ruling. Crockett's political allies sat frozen in disbelief. Legal analysts watching across the country stared at their screens, stunned by the conservative justice's unexpected environmental activism. As security moved to restore order, Crockett suddenly rose. Tears streaming down her face, she raised her hand, requesting permission to address the court directly. Chief Justice Roberts began to deny this extraordinary breach of protocol, but Justice Gorsuch raised his hand, silencing his colleague. "I want to hear what the Congresswoman has to say." When Crockett finally spoke, her words, just 27 of them, would change everything about the case, Justice Gorsuch's perception, and the national conversation about environmental justice in America. Don't miss this extraordinary story of accountability, redemption, and unexpected truth. Hit subscribe now to see how a conservative Supreme Court justice and a progressive Congresswoman found common ground that transformed American environmental law forever. Justice Neil Gorsuch had built his judicial reputation on unwavering principle. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 2017 after serving on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, Gorsuch had established himself as a jurist whose rulings often defied simplistic political labels. While nominated by a Republican president, Gorsuch had consistently demonstrated that his textualist judicial philosophy could lead him to surprising conclusions. In environmental cases particularly, he had shown a willingness to hold corporations accountable when statutory language clearly supported such outcomes. What distinguishes Justice Gorsuch is his intellectual consistency, explained legal scholar Marcus Patterson. He follows his interpretive principles wherever they lead, even when they don't align with traditional conservative positions. At 56, Gorsuch had emerged as one of the court's most influential voices. His opinions were characterized by clarity, precision, and occasional literary flourishes that made complex legal concepts accessible to ordinary Americans. His questioning during oral arguments was legendarily incisive, often exposing weaknesses that attorneys had believed well concealed. In recent years, Gorsuch had shown particular interest in cases involving what he termed regulatory hypocrisy, situations where powerful individuals sought to benefit from regulations while personally evading them. "The rule of law means nothing if it doesn't apply equally to everyone," he had stated in a recent address at Georgetown Law School. "When those who write our laws believe themselves exempt from following them, the very foundation of democratic governance is threatened." This philosophy had placed him on an ideological collision course with Representative Jasmine Crockett. Before entering Congress 3 years earlier, Crockett had built a successful career as both attorney and entrepreneur. After graduating from Howard University Law School, she had founded Crockett Industries, a manufacturing company that specialized in industrial chemicals and cleaning products. The company had grown rapidly, eventually employing over 2,000 people across facilities in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Crockett's political rise had been equally meteoric. running on a platform that emphasized environmental justice for underserved communities. She had won her congressional seat in a stunning upset against a longtime incumbent. Her passionate speeches about corporate responsibility and the disproportionate environmental burden borne by minority communities had made her a rising star in progressive circles. Representative Crockett brought moral clarity to environmental debates, noted political analyst Sophia Washington. Her first-hand experience as both a successful business owner and advocate for underserved communities gave her unique credibility when discussing the balance between economic growth and environmental protection. In Congress, Crockett had championed the Environmental Justice Act, legislation designed to strengthen EPA oversight of industrial facilities operating near residential communities. Her personal story, growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood near an industrial zone, had featured prominently in her advocacy. "I know what it means when companies treat certain communities as sacrifice zones," she had testified during committee hearings. "The children who grow up breathing polluted air and drinking contaminated water are not abstractions to me. They are my childhood neighbors, my family, my community." The clash between these two formidable individuals had begun 3 years earlier when EPA investigations uncovered evidence suggesting Crockett Industries had systematically discharged chemical waste into groundwater near its Louisiana facility. Further investigation revealed similar patterns at the company's other locations. Most damaging were internal company emails suggesting Crockett herself, while serving as CEO, had approved a strategy to conceal environmental testing data from regulators. These communications had emerged after the company's former environmental compliance officer became a whistleblower. The case had worked its way through lower courts, with Crockett's legal team arguing procedural violations in the collection of evidence. When the Supreme Court had unexpectedly granted certiorari, legal experts anticipated a ruling on narrow technical grounds related to EPA's investigative authority. Instead, Justice Gorsuch had led the court in a sweeping 6-3 decision that not only upheld the EPA's findings, but established new precedent for corporate environmental liability. The billion-dollar penalty, unprecedented in environmental cases, had sent shockwaves through corporate America. But even more shocking was Gorsuch's direct condemnation of Crockett's apparent hypocrisy in advocating for environmental regulations she had allegedly violated. As news cameras broadcast Crockett's tearful request to address the court, the nation witnessed the convergence of two narrative threads that would reshape the public's understanding of both the case and the individuals at its center. What would this progressive Congresswoman possibly say that could change the mind of a justice who had just delivered the most severe corporate environmental penalty in American history? Share your predictions in the comments below about what you think Crockett might reveal to the court. The Supreme Court chamber, normally a model of decorum, had transformed into a scene of extraordinary tension. Congresswoman Crockett stood at the defendant's table, her attorney frantically whispering objections that she firmly waved away. Chief Justice Roberts looked decidedly uncomfortable with this breach of protocol. "Ms. Crockett, I must remind you that oral arguments have concluded. The court has rendered its decision." Justice Gorsuch, however, leaned forward with evident interest. "I believe we can make an exception in this instance, Chief Justice. The court has inherent authority to ensure justice is fully served." This rare disagreement between the court's two leading conservative voices created momentary confusion. After a brief whispered consultation, Roberts reluctantly nodded. "You have 3 minutes, Representative Crockett," Gorsuch stated, his tone making clear this was an extraordinary accommodation. "Use them wisely." Crockett took a deep breath, visibly gathering her composure. The tears that had begun flowing at the announcement of the verdict continued, but her voice grew steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honors, I stand before you convicted of environmental crimes I did not commit, facing a financial penalty that will destroy a company providing thousands of jobs in communities that desperately need them." Justice Sotomayor's expression revealed skepticism. "The evidence presented to this court was quite compelling, Representative Crockett." "The evidence is fabricated," Crockett replied directly, "and I can prove it." This bold claim caused murmurs to ripple through the chamber. Justice Gorsuch's eyebrows raised slightly. That is a serious allegation. It is the truth, Your Honor. Crockett reached into her briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. This contains evidence that was deliberately withheld from my attorneys and this court by individuals within the EPA who targeted my company for political reasons. Her attorney appeared completely surprised by this development, confirming this was not a rehearsed legal strategy. Crockett continued with growing intensity. 3 days ago, I received an anonymous package containing internal EPA communications. These documents reveal that the environmental testing data allegedly from my company was actually fabricated by a senior EPA official who objected to my proposed amendments to the Environmental Justice Act. The Justice Department attorney representing the EPA rose immediately to object. Your Honor, this is highly improper. If such evidence existed, it should have been presented during regular proceedings. I agree it's improper, Gorsuch replied, his tone measured. But that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. He addressed Crockett directly. Why should this court consider evidence that you mysteriously received after oral arguments concluded? It was at this moment that Crockett delivered the statement that would be replayed on news broadcasts for weeks to come. Because I grew up drinking water poisoned by corporate negligence, Your Honor, my mother died of kidney failure when I was 12. My childhood neighborhood has cancer rates 4 times the national average. Fighting environmental injustice isn't just my political position. It's why I entered public service. Her voice broke, but she continued. I would never do to another community what was done to mine. I would never poison another child's mother. The company that bears my name has the most rigorous environmental protocols in our industry precisely because I know the human cost of cutting corners. Someone wants to destroy me because I'm effective, not because I'm guilty. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the Justice Department attorneys appeared moved by the raw emotion in Crockett's voice. Justice Gorsuch studied her intently. Representative Crockett, are you suggesting this entire case is the result of deliberate falsification of evidence by government officials? Yes, Your Honor, and the documents in this envelope prove it. After a moment of consideration, Gorsuch made an unprecedented decision. The court will take a 1-hour recess to review these materials. Marshal, please secure that envelope. As the justices filed out, legal commentators watching the proceedings struggled to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Never in modern Supreme Court history had a decision been interrupted for consideration of new evidence after being announced. During the recess, speculation ran rampant. Constitutional scholars debated the court's authority to reconsider an announced decision. Political analysts dissected possible motivations for targeting Crockett. Environmental groups expressed concern that a potential reversal could undermine regulatory enforcement more broadly. When the justices returned, their expressions gave nothing away. Chief Justice Roberts spoke first. Having reviewed the materials provided by Representative Crockett, this court finds sufficient cause for concern regarding the integrity of evidence presented in this case. Justice Gorsuch then delivered the court's modified ruling. The judgment against Crockett Industries is hereby stayed pending a full investigation of the allegations of evidence tampering. This court is referring this matter to the Department of Justice Inspector General for immediate review. He continued with evident conviction. Let me be absolutely clear. If these allegations prove true, those responsible for falsifying evidence will face severe consequences. This court will not tolerate abuse of government power to target political opponents, regardless of party or position. This extraordinary development created a courtroom scene unlike any in recent memory. EPA attorneys huddled in stunned consultation. Crockett's legal team appeared equally shocked by this unexpected reprieve. And at the center of it all stood Congresswoman Crockett, her tears now replaced by an expression of vindicated determination. As the session concluded, Justice Gorsuch made one final statement that would reshape the narrative entirely. Representative Crockett, this court owes you an apology for not ensuring all evidence was properly vetted. While the investigation proceeds, I hope you will continue your important work advocating for communities affected by environmental negligence. This acknowledgement, a Supreme Court justice apologizing to a defendant, was unprecedented in modern judicial history. As Crockett left the courtroom, the image of conservative Justice Gorsuch and progressive Representative Crockett, finding common ground in defense of both procedural integrity and environmental justice, created a powerful moment that transcended typical political divisions. The aftermath of the Supreme Court's extraordinary reversal unfolded with remarkable speed. Within 48 hours, the Department of Justice Inspector General had assembled a special task force to investigate Crockett's allegations of evidence tampering. "We take these claims extremely seriously," announced Inspector General Melissa Rodriguez at a hastily arranged press conference. "Falsification of evidence undermines the very foundation of our justice system. This investigation will be thorough, independent, and swift." Media coverage reflected the unprecedented nature of the situation. Legal analysts struggled to find historical parallels for a Supreme Court decision reversed based on post-judgment evidence. Political commentators noted the unusual alliance between a conservative justice and progressive Congresswoman against potential agency misconduct. For Justice Gorsuch, the decision to reconsider the court's ruling represented a powerful demonstration of his judicial philosophy. When interviewed for a legal journal several weeks later, he explained his reasoning. "The court's ultimate obligation is to justice, not procedural rigidity," Gorsuch stated. "When credible evidence suggests a serious miscarriage of justice, even at the 11th hour, we have a duty to consider it. No procedural rule should prevent us from correcting a fundamental injustice." This statement, emphasizing substance over procedure, surprised many legal scholars who had categorized Gorsuch as a procedural formalist. Constitutional law professor James Harrington noted the significance. Justice Gorsuch demonstrated that his textualism isn't simply about rigid adherence to rules, but about ensuring the legal system functions as intended. It's a more nuanced position than many critics had attributed to him. For Representative Crockett, the aftermath brought both vindication and new challenges. While her company had received a temporary reprieve, the investigation into her allegations placed her at the center of a political firestorm. 3 weeks after the Supreme Court hearing, the Inspector General's office released preliminary findings that sent shockwaves through Washington. Forensic analysis of environmental testing data had revealed clear evidence of manipulation. Email communications recovered from EPA servers confirmed that a senior official had indeed targeted Crockett Industries specifically because of the Congresswoman's proposed amendments to environmental legislation. "The evidence supports Representative Crockett's allegations," the Inspector General announced. "We have identified multiple instances where testing data was deliberately altered to support enforcement actions against Crockett Industries." This confirmation transformed the narrative completely. Crockett, initially portrayed as a hypocritical corporate polluter, was now being characterized as the victim of political persecution. Justice Gorsuch, initially seen as imposing an excessive penalty, was now praised for his willingness to consider evidence that others might have rejected. The most significant moment in Crockett's vindication came during congressional oversight hearings investigating the EPA misconduct. The Congresswoman testified about her experience, but rather than focusing solely on her personal vindication, she broadened the conversation to address systemic issues. "What happened to me and my company was wrong," she stated firmly. "But we must not allow this incident to undermine necessary environmental enforcement. The solution to regulatory misconduct isn't to weaken regulations, it's to strengthen oversight and accountability." This nuanced position earned praise from across the political spectrum. Environmental advocates appreciated her continued commitment to strong regulations despite her personal experience. Conservative commentators noted her emphasis on accountability and proper process. Perhaps most remarkably, Justice Gorsuch himself broke with tradition by accepting an invitation to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee regarding the court's handling of the case. While careful not to discuss specific legal details, his testimony emphasized broader principles. When government agencies wield enforcement power, they must do so with absolute integrity, Gorsuch stated. Evidence must be beyond reproach, procedures must be scrupulously fair, and political considerations must never influence enforcement decisions. This rare agreement between figures typically positioned as ideological opposites created the foundation for an unlikely partnership. 6 months after the Supreme Court hearing, Representative Crockett introduced legislation aimed at strengthening both environmental protection and enforcement integrity. The bill included provisions creating independent review of environmental testing data and stronger whistleblower protections for those reporting misconduct within regulatory agencies. In a move that shocked Washington observers, Justice Gorsuch, while maintaining judicial neutrality on the specific legislation, published a law review article endorsing the general principles behind Crockett's reforms. Effective environmental protection requires public confidence in both the necessity of regulations and the integrity of enforcement, he wrote. When political considerations corrupt the regulatory process, both legitimate business interests and environmental protection suffer. This convergence of perspectives from opposite ends of the political spectrum created momentum for reform that transcended typical partisan divisions. The legislation, eventually titled the Regulatory Integrity and Environmental Protection Act, gained surprising bipartisan support. Senator James Mitchell, a conservative who typically opposed environmental regulations, explained his support. "This isn't about more or less regulation. It's about ensuring that whatever regulations exist are enforced fairly, consistently, and based on accurate information." For Crockett personally, the experience transformed her public image and political effectiveness. Rather than being marginalized by controversy, she emerged as a uniquely credible voice on issues of regulatory reform. Her personal experience facing fabricated charges gave her moral authority when advocating for both strong environmental protection and procedural fairness. 1 year after the Supreme Court hearing, President Robinson awarded Crockett the Presidential Medal of Freedom, citing her extraordinary courage in facing unjust persecution and her commitment to strengthening American institutions through meaningful reform. In his remarks at the ceremony, the president noted the broader significance of the Crockett case. In an era of division, Representative Crockett and Justice Gorsuch have demonstrated that integrity, fairness, and commitment to truth can transcend political differences. Their example reminds us that our shared values as Americans are stronger than the ideologies that sometimes divide us. The long-term impact of the Crockett case extended far beyond its immediate legal resolution. What began as a routine environmental enforcement action had evolved into a watershed moment for regulatory reform, judicial philosophy, and environmental justice in America. For the legal system, the case established important new precedents. The Supreme Court's willingness to consider post-judgment evidence in extraordinary circumstances created what legal scholars termed the Crockett exception to finality rules. While narrowly defined to prevent abuse, this doctrine acknowledged that justice sometimes requires procedural flexibility. The Crockett exception represents a significant evolution in judicial thinking, explained Harvard Law professor Eleanor Martinez. It balances the essential need for finality in legal proceedings with the recognition that justice must ultimately prevail over procedure when genuine miscarriages of justice are identified. Justice Gorsuch's jurisprudence evolved as well. In subsequent environmental cases, he demonstrated increased attention to factual details and greater skepticism toward government evidence. His questions during oral arguments frequently probed the reliability of testing data and the independence of government experts. In a landmark opinion issued 2 years after the Crockett case, Gorsuch articulated what became known as the evidentiary integrity doctrine, writing that courts must be particularly vigilant when evaluating technical evidence presented by agencies that may have regulatory or political interests in specific outcomes. This emphasis on evidentiary integrity influenced judicial approaches across the federal bench. District and circuit courts began applying heightened scrutiny to technical evidence in regulatory cases, regardless of which party might benefit. The result was a legal environment that demanded greater rigor and transparency from all participants. For environmental regulation specifically, the aftermath of the Crockett case drove significant reforms. The Regulatory Integrity and Environmental Protection Act established new standards for environmental testing, including mandatory independent verification of data used in enforcement actions. The legislation created an Environmental Evidence Review Board composed of scientists from academia and industry to evaluate testing protocols and results. Most significantly, the legislation separated enforcement decisions from policy development within the EPA, creating structural barriers against the kind of politicized enforcement that had targeted Crockett Industries. Environmental groups initially feared these reforms would weaken protection, but the opposite proved true. With increased confidence in the integrity of enforcement actions, courts became more willing to uphold significant penalties in legitimate cases of environmental violations. The perception that environmental enforcement might be politically motivated had previously led some judges to view such cases with skepticism. The Crockett reforms actually strengthened environmental enforcement where it matters most, noted Sierra Club Executive Director Michael Johnson. By ensuring that enforcement actions are based on unimpeachable evidence, these reforms have made it much harder for genuine polluters to evade responsibility through procedural challenges. The political impact proved equally significant. Representative Crockett's experience demonstrated how environmental protection and regulatory integrity could be aligned rather than opposed. This framing helped bridge traditional partisan divides on environmental issues. Conservative figures who had typically opposed environmental regulation found themselves supporting stronger enforcement against actual violations while maintaining their stance against regulatory overreach. Progressive advocates recognized that procedural fairness and evidentiary integrity ultimately strengthened rather than weakened environmental protection. This realignment created space for productive collaboration across party lines. The Congressional Environmental Working Group, co-founded by Crockett and Republican Congressman William Stevenson, developed a series of targeted reforms addressing specific environmental challenges while incorporating robust procedural protections for regulated entities. The Crockett case taught us that false choices between environmental protection and fair process ultimately serve neither, Congressman Stevenson explained during committee hearings. We can and must have both if we're serious about addressing environmental challenges effectively. Perhaps most significantly, the case transformed the national conversation about environmental justice. Crockett's personal story, growing up in a community affected by industrial pollution, then being falsely accused of similar violations, created a powerful narrative that resonated across ideological lines. Her consistent emphasis on protecting vulnerable communities while ensuring regulatory fairness established a new framework for discussing environmental justice. Rather than portraying environmental protection and economic development as inherently opposed, Crockett articulated a vision where responsible businesses could thrive while communities received genuine protection. 3 years after the Supreme Court hearing, Crockett Industries had become a model for corporate environmental responsibility. The company voluntarily implemented continuous emissions monitoring with real-time public reporting, established community oversight boards at all facilities, and created scholarship programs for environmental science students from affected communities. What nearly destroyed us has ultimately made us stronger, Crockett explained at a business leaders conference. We've demonstrated that environmental responsibility and business success aren't mutually exclusive. They're mutually reinforcing when done right. Justice Gorsuch and Representative Crockett continued their unlikely alliance in promoting principles they both valued. While maintaining appropriate separation between judicial and legislative roles, they appeared together at law school forums discussing the importance of evidentiary integrity, procedural fairness, and depoliticized regulation. At one such event at Yale Law School, Justice Gorsuch reflected on the broader significance of the case that had brought them together. What began as an adversarial legal proceeding ultimately revealed our shared commitment to fundamental principles: that justice must be based on truth, that power must be exercised with integrity, and that our system works best when we hold each other accountable across partisan and ideological lines. Crockett's response captured the case's enduring legacy. The lesson here isn't about who won or lost in court. It's that our system can still correct its mistakes when people of good faith prioritize truth and justice over partisan advantage. That's something all Americans should celebrate, regardless of political affiliation. This emphasis on shared values despite political differences provided a template for addressing other polarized issues in American society. The Crockett-Gorsuch model became shorthand for approaches that identified common principles beneath political disagreements and built solutions on that foundation. For ordinary Americans, the case offered a powerful reminder that the system, despite its flaws, could still deliver justice when individuals stood firm on principle. The image of tears streaming down Crockett's face as she defended her integrity before the nation's highest court became an iconic symbol of courage against unjust accusation. As one commentator noted on the 5th anniversary of the case, "In an era when many Americans doubt whether truth still matters in public life, the Crockett case demonstrated that it does, that facts can still prevail over fiction, integrity over expedience, and justice over power when people of conviction insist on being heard." If you believe in the importance of both environmental protection and procedural fairness in our legal system, share this video with others who value these principles regardless of political affiliation. And don't forget to subscribe for more content examining how our democratic institutions can work better when we focus on shared values rather than partisan divisions. Together we can build a country where justice, integrity, and environmental responsibility go hand in hand.